right, welcome to APUSH review lecture for period 4, the antebellum period, 1800 to 1848. All right, when you think about those two dates, you should think of two different things. 1800 is the election of Thomas Jefferson as president and the switch from the Federalists to the Jeffersonian Republicans as kind of a hallmark election in which we see the transfer of power peacefully. And then 1848 is the Seneca Falls Convention, in which women and women's rights advocates come together to demand equality. And so what you see in this period in 1800 is really the United States and the Republic of the United States is really taking form, right? We had the early Republic with period 3 as the creation of the Revolution, the creation of the Constitution, and the Federalists really kind of taking that Constitution and making it into something. And then the Jeffersonian Republicans come in 1800, and they, along with the absolutely massively growing population of the United States, will take that republic and develop it even further and go through some major changes that'll lead us into eventually the sectional crisis and the Civil War of the 1850s and 60s. So let's jump into it. When we think about period 4, one of the first things we think about is the massive change in American politics. All right, starting with the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson becomes president. This is in the midst of our first party system, the Federalists versus the Jeffersonian Republicans. The Federalists being, of course, advocates for larger, federal power, larger national government power, while the Jeffersonian Republicans tended to favor more smaller government power. The Federalists tended to be more northern and eastern, while the Jeffersonian Republicans tended to be more southern and western. And there's the fight in this first party system about everything. And we can go back to Jefferson versus Hamilton. I mean, they begin the division, right, with the debate over whether or not the United States government should have a hand in the banking system, the financial system, whether or not a tariff was constitutional or not, whether or not taxing was constitutional or not, to what extent can the government tax, and things of that nature, right? So when you look at these debates over federal power, even though the Jeffersonian Republicans are taking control, they only reduce federal power in a very small amount. All right, and in fact, with the court system under John Marshall, you actually do see the expansion of federal power, the expansion of national government power, with the court cases like Marbury versus Madison. All right, so some quick ways to remember that one is like Marbury versus Madison deals with the issue of judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland is about the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution and how the U.S. Constitution is supreme over the state constitutions. And what you see with all these cases, Marbury, McCulloch, Worcester, Gibbons, and Dartmouth, is John Marshall and the Marshall Supreme Court will be pushing federal constitutional power and expanding federal constitutional power. Okay. Now, we'll wait on the last part of this until a later slide, but also understand that it's during this time in the early 1800s that the United States continues on a quest that had been on since the colonial period, and that is to expand westward. And we're going to see it expand westward through diplomacy and through exploration and through the taking of territory from Native Americans and other European and imperial powers in North America. And so we'll look at that a little bit more detail here in a little bit. All right. When we talk about period 4, we also have the issue of slavery really becoming an even bigger issue during this time. And again, one of the things about the curriculum during this time is that they do a lot of repeats. So we're going to get more into positive good and the slave system down here somewhere. Okay. But understand that regionalism really kind of affects American understanding of slavery during this time. If you're in the Northeast, slavery is not a huge issue, all right? But if you're in the South, and especially after the Cotton Revolution of the early 1800s, slavery is the way of life if you're a white Southerner. And so Southerners are going to really start to change the way they view slavery from a necessary evil to a positive good. All right. You also have, besides divisions between the regions, the Northeast, the South, and the West, over slavery, you also have debates about the federal government and internal improvements and issues of that nature. So when we think about it, if you're the South, you don't like the tariff, so you're going to have the tariff crisis of 1828 with the tariff of abominations that will eventually lead to the compromise tariff of 1833. That's going to cause that tariff crisis is going to cause the United States government to pass the Force Act and basically argue that it's allowed to enforce the tariff if necessary with the military. All right, you have the debates over the American system, like the tariff of 1816 or the internal improvements or the Second Bank of the United States. In the Northeast and the West tended to be in favor of those things, while the South was not. You have deep divisions regionally in the political landscape of the United States, just as you have deep divisions nationally in the first party and eventually the second party system. All right. Now, when we look at America and the world during this period, all right, really it all centers around one person. That's John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State under James Monroe. James Monroe is our 5th president of the United States. And John Quincy Adams is a lifelong diplomat who had been trained by his father and his mother to be a diplomat. And he's going to help kind of solidify the form and the shape of the United States that you know of it today. All right. After the War of 1812, in which the United States and Britain fight each other to a draw, John Quincy Adams is going to help negotiate the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which will open up the Great Lakes to trade between both the British and the United States and demilitarize the Canadian-American border. You have the Convention of 1818, in which you see the United States and Canadian border kind of formalized in between the Great Lakes and the Rocky Mountains. You have the Adams-Onis Treaty, in which the United States takes large chunks of Spain. At that time, it was Spain, including Florida, and it formalizes the boundary between the Spanish territories and the American territories. All right. And then, of course, you have the Monroe Doctrine, which is a huge part of the legacy of John Quincy Adams, in which the United States is basically laid claim to the Western Hemisphere. And this really starts the United States on this path towards a hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere. It doesn't have it in 1823 whenever the Monroe Doctrine is issued. In fact, the British are the ones who are going to enforce it for us. But you do see, kind of in the words of Hamilton and Jefferson early on, the idea of the creation of the American Empire and the Empire for Liberty, and then John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State taking massive chunks of territory. Oh yeah, the Louisiana Purchase, then the chunks of territory under John Quincy Adams. You have the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says Europe, you're cut out of this equation as the United States creates its empire in the Western Hemisphere. And that will eventually lead the United States into annexing Texas in 1845. It leads the United States to taking chunks of Minnesota and Maine in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And this all together, encapsulates this understanding that the United States will call the Manifest Destiny, which is, of course, the U.S. arguing that it has a destiny to rule over the Western Hemisphere. All right, and we, of course, when we talk about manifest destiny, it's very important that that's not a thing that actually exists. There's no destiny for the United States to take over the Western Hemisphere. It is a belief that the people of the United States had in the 19th century, and they believed that it was their destiny to take over. That wasn't an actual thing, right? We can't sit here and say America was destined to be what it is today. All right, because that takes away agency and contingency when we talk about history. But understanding that people who were pro-imperialism in the 19th century understood America as having a manifest destiny is important in our historical understanding of the time period. So they don't see what they're doing as imperial. They don't see what they're doing as, taking and invading land from Native Americans. What they see it as this kind of almost, this what will later be called a white man's burden to spread civilization and take control of what was given to them in some manifest way. Okay. Another huge issue in period 4, besides those early empire building aspects in America growing in the world, is the issue of commerce and manufacturing. Starting with Hamilton's financial plan in the early republic, the United States is set on a path towards industrialization beginning in the 19th century. Industrialization creeps over from Britain. All right, you have Samuel Slater and Lowell developing the factory system, along with Eli Whitney and the development of mass production and interchangeable parts. And these ideas come together to create the American manufacturing system. And out of that, you have entrepreneurs and innovators who are creating new materials and new manufactured goods that are going to become kind of cornerstones of the American industrialization early on. People like John Deere developing a steel plow. All right, Cyrus McCormick developing the mechanical reaper. Samuel Slater and Lowell creating the factory system. Eli Whitney creating the cotton gin and developing interchangeable parts. All right, Robert Fulton developing the steam engine or the steamboat and the commercial viability of the steamboat. All right, all of these individuals will come together to create an American industrial system centered on textiles early on and cotton production in the South. All right, Henry Clay, a young nationalistic senator and congressman, will urge the United States to kind of continue on the path that Hamilton had set forth in the 1790s to create a national market. It's what he calls the American system. And the American system has 3 parts. All right, you have a tariff to protect American industry. So you're developing these textile mills in the Northeast, and in order to protect them from competition from British textile mills, you have to create a tariff, a tax on any British good that's coming in order for people to buy American. You have to have a Bank of the United States to help stabilize the currency and provide loans to these businesses. And then, of course, you need internal improvements like canals and roads and eventual railroads to link the Northeast to the West to the South and make sure that the market is sustainable, that you can get your manufactured goods from the Northeast to the West and the South, that you can get your raw commodities like cotton from the South up to the Northeast, and that you can get your food that's being produced in the West over to the Northeast. And this is really where you see the American system succeeding. And you have some big internal improvements that are created during this time. You have the Erie Canal built in 1825 in the state of New York that connects New York City to the western portion of the United States through the Great Lakes. And this is going to make New York City kind of the financial and commercial hub and center of American commerce. Now you have the Cumberland Road that connects the eastern portion of the United States to the interior, to the western portion of the United States. It's also known as the National Road. And then even beyond just the internal markets that are being created, you have the United States beginning early reaches out into the international trade market. Now we all know, because of the issues surrounding War of 1812, the issues surrounding the Federalist era, that there was trade between the United States and France and the United States and Great Britain. But the United States has always been about opening up international trade, and we see that with the Treaty of Wangya, in which you have the United States early on kind of entering into the markets of China, and we'll see it again when we get to Commodore Perry in the 1850s and the opening up of trade in Japan. And so America really will start seeing this kind of the advent of the Yankee trader. The Americans is kind of a nickname for Americans in the world are Yankees. So Yankee traders are Americans coming around to sell their goods. Now, while the market revolution is creating these massive changes in industrialization and cities, you also see it creating changes in society. All right. The market revolution and the early industrialization, along with turmoil and economic issues in Europe, are going to bring massive new immigrants into the United States, immigrants that are very different from immigration from before. If you look at old immigrants, you're talking about the English and the Welsh, and the Scots-Irish. If you're looking at new immigrants in the 1840s and 50s, we're talking about the Germans and the Irish. And they're going to be bringing in large amounts of Catholicism, and they're going to also bring in a large amounts of nativism as they move into the country. English-based, English-born or Americans that were born in the United States are going to start to develop a distaste for immigration. We're going to see this kind of nativism come up over and over again. Other societal changes besides the movement of immigrants into the country for labor will be, of course, labor issues themselves. As industrialization increases throughout the first half of the 19th century, workers are going to start to unionize. Unions are going to be declared constitutional in Massachusetts in a court case called Commonwealth v. Hunt. And then you have these early kind of regional labor organizations that develop, like in the Lowell factory system. The Lowell girls will develop their own labor union, and they're not hugely successful, but you do start seeing labor organized to try to get better pay, better hours, better protections. The market revolution will not only just bring in these issues for labor, but it also helps start creating a middle class. And what we see is in the United States, a middle class starts to develop. And really a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here in period 4, you see it again in period 6, right? So if you looked at those two periods, you're going to see a lot of similarities between period 4 and period 6. But the middle class starts to form, and they form in a way to try to differentiate themselves from the working or underclasses. So when you think about the middle class, if you're talking about the working class, women are going to work, kids are going to work, they have to work in order to pay the bills. But if you're talking about the middle class, you're going to see this development of the cult of domesticity, and this idea that women have a place in the home, and that's their job, is to be housemakers, homemakers, and mothers. And you're going to, of course, have a lot of women who are resistant to that. People like Lydia Child and the Grimke sisters and the antebellum reformers, who see that as kind of confining, all right, in many ways. Now, when we think about period 4, I think a lot of us go to Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is kind of the typical kind of political figure that most people go to with period 4. The advent of Jacksonian democracy, of course, is a huge misnomer. But you do see, starting in the election of 1824 and 1828, is a movement in the states towards participatory democracy, which means that people are participating in the democratic process. Now, how do they do that, and who are the people that are participating? Those are the big questions, right? They do it by eliminating the tax and the property requirements for voting, and moving towards what is called universal white male suffrage. Now, you notice that even in the term universal white male suffrage, the people voting are white men, okay? And when the people voting are white men, the people they vote for are white men. So you see this kind of perpetual nature in which the power is held within the white male sphere. All right. Now, out of the election of 1824, you get the argument, this is that election. If you remember, it's the election that Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams fought over. And John Quincy Adams won, even though he didn't have a majority of either the electoral votes or the popular vote. He won through the House of Representatives. Now, Andrew Jackson will call this a corrupt bargain, and he'll use it for 4 years to destroy the reputation of John Quincy Adams, and then Andrew Jackson will win in 1828. And with the growth of Andrew Jackson in 1828, you see the development of a second party system. The first party system, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans, will die off. The Federalists die off after the War of 1812, so that by 1820, really, the Federalists are no longer a functional party. And then by 1828 into 1830, you see the development of two different factions within the Democratic Republicans. You have the Democrats, who kind of rally behind Andrew Jackson, and then you have the Whigs, who will rally behind Clay. And so that becomes the division of the second party system. Don't ask how to define a Whig. No one knows. All we know is that they did not like Andrew Jackson. All right, and they believed that there should be more power in the Congress. All right, so that's the old kind of English Whig attitude. All right. Now, one of the things that Andrew Jackson is known for, and we could go into a lot with Andrew Jackson, he's known for using the spoil system, which means he gave jobs to his followers. He's also known for the tariff crisis of the 1828-1832. He's known for vetoing the bank at the Bank War. But one of the big things he's known for is, of course, his Native American relations. Now, it's a misunderstanding in U.S. history to think that you go from the Revolution to the Trail of Tears and nothing happened in between. In fact, there are numerous events in between the Revolution, the Trail of Tears, that led the United States from the Revolution to that infamous period. Native American groups who had been pushed out to the western portion of the United States, they formed into new confederacies. For example, Tecumseh will take the Shawnee tribes of the Northwest, the Ohio River Valley, and he will start creating a confederacy. That confederacy will lose in the Battle of Tippecanoe. You have the Seminoles down in Florida and the southeastern portion of the United States fighting to keep their land and keep their way of life in the southeast. They're going to lose. And then, of course, you have the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and so forth, who are going to lose because of the Indian Removal Act. So you have these numerous, acts of resistance and attempts to integrate into the United States. And in the end, it becomes very clear that white Americans who are in control of the territory and who have the resources and the weapons will just force out Native Americans whenever they deem necessary. And we see that with the Trail of Tears, as the 5 groups in the Southeast are taken by the U.S. military and forced into the Indian Territory, which will later become Oklahoma. Period 4 also sees a growth of American nationalism in art and American identity in art. When we think about American art, early American art is very much just Europe copied, right? The American artists who were prevalent, I forgot the names, but the guy who painted the signing of the Declaration, it's going to bother me, but I'll come back to it later. All right, they all trained under European artists, but what you see in the 1800s is a movement away from that kind of European-based neoclassicism into a European-based romanticism that we call transcendentalism in the United States. And so you have your first American art school formed. It's called the Hudson River School of Art, and they are known for gigantic landscapes that highlighted America's natural beauty with very little human presence in the paintings themselves. If you look at a Hudson River School of Art painting, you're going to see a lot of trees and rivers and all the natural parts of upstate New York, but you're not going to see a lot of human elements in there. You're not going to see humans. They're going to be small. They're going to be in the background, and they're going to be very minuscule. In writing, you have the Transcendentalist movement, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who are going to be, when you think of Transcendentalism, it's this movement to get away from the market revolution and consumerism and what they considered was like the shallowness of American society. And they just wanted to go and farm and live by a pond and think about nature. And they thought by doing that they could find this inner kind of awesomeness, this inner sublimeness. They could find their inner self, and they could then, perfect who they are as a person. And they're going to be, the transcendentalists will eventually, they'll be very influential when it comes to like the Beats and the hippies of the 1960s, who go back and read that and say, yes, modern society is so shallow, we must leave it, right? And you'll see that kind of come back up in the 1960s. Now, the transcendentalists are not the only writers. You do have what we call Knickerbocker writers. These are anti-transcendentalists or dark romantics, however you want to phrase them. People like James Fenimore Cooper and Washington Irving, they're going to be more popular writers. And then you've got Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter, and Edgar Allan Poe, who will write some very dark and sinister mysteries and dark Gothic, writing. And so you're going to see that kind of duality in American literature in the early 1800s. Beyond that, you have James Audubon, who is sketching the birds of North America. I think most white Southerners probably have a copy of James Audubon's birds somewhere around, and they make calendars out of them now, but they're very famous drawings of North American birds. And then you see American nationalism, American identity come out through language, right? That Noah Webster creates the first American dictionary, and so you start seeing that divergence of British English and American English with Noah Webster's English dictionary. The other huge event from period 4 will be the Second Great Awakening. Now, similar to the First Great Awakening, it is a revival movement, a revival of religion, and it's centered around this idea that society is imperfect. Now, the First Great Awakening kind of typically led people to focus on their individual selves. The Second Great Awakening, though, will lead people to believe and focus more on perfecting society. We call it millennialism. This idea that you must perfect society to create the second coming of Jesus. And so out of the revivalism of Charles Finney, you're going to see these kind of these reform movements. You're going to see the Utopias, the Brook Farm and the Oneidas and the Shakers come together to try to create a perfect society and escape from the broken society of the United States. You're going to see the American Temperance Society formed in order to try to stop people from drinking too much. You're going to see Dorothea Dix go after prisons and start to try to reform prisons. Horace Mann is going to try to reform American education. And then, of course, you have the abolitionist movement going after what they consider the biggest American flaw and American evil, and that is slavery. So the American Colonization Society, who would be much more kind of gradual emancipators, versus the American Anti-Slavery Society, which would be much more immediate. And that's a huge development in American abolitionism early on in the 1820s and 30s. Is this movement away from gradualism to immediatism in the terms of emancipation. All right. And out of all these reform movements, most of them are led by middle-class white reformers, and a lot of them are led by women. And so women are going to find a lot of agency and a lot of power within these reform movements, and that's going to lead to a burgeoning and growing women's rights movement that's going to eventually meet up at Seneca Falls, New York, and create the Declaration of Sentiments, in which they declare that all men and women are equal. And people like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will lead that charge to demand equality. And that'll start our first wave of feminism that lasts the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century, as women are fighting for the right to vote and fighting for that equality in American society. It's not all fun and games, of course. When we think about period 4 and what's happening in the South is going through what's known as the Cotton Revolution. Eli Whitney's development of the cotton gin in the 1790s will lead to the growth of cotton as the way of life in the South. And that's going to lead into some very harsh times for African Americans. All right, you have the Second Middle Passage, in which Northerners are selling slaves that they do not no longer need or are afraid of losing down into the South, and even in the South, you have enslaved African Americans moving from the upper South, the Virginia area, down into the lower South, into the cotton plantations. You have a development of a mental understanding of this is all centered around racism, and John C. Calhoun is going to codify by saying that slavery is a part of the Southern way of life because it is a positive good, right? That African Americans are incapable of being civilized, and therefore slavery is forcing civilization on them, and that idea is being bought into more and more by white Southerners, because you have that creation of that power structure in which at the very bottom are enslaved African Americans, and then right above that last part of the social ladder is landless, poor white Americans. And what you're seeing here is the distinct development and the playing off of each other of those two groups in order to create a slaveocracy in which the planters have all the power and the bottom two rungs of society have no power. All right, but instead of focusing on the fact that they have no power and the planters have all the power, white Americans in the lower half of the social ladder just constantly think about how African Americans could take their power, and so they fight with them, and that creates this racial animosity at the lower end of the social ladder that help perpetuate the racism and the stereotypes and the anger and the resentment, the discrimination, and the inequity of society. African Americans, of course, did not just take this like just waiting around for the Emancipation Proclamation. African Americans within the slave system exhibited immense amounts of agency. You have some failed rebellions like Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, who will create more animosity and more fear of a slave rebellion, which will increase the slave codes in these southern states. But beyond that, you have the everyday resistance. We've talked about this before: the slowing down work, the sabotaging labor tools, right? The running away, ways that you can basically resist giving your full labor to this oppressor, this slave owner. You have a distinct African American culture developing and a distinct African American church developing out of the Second Great Awakening, like the African Methodist Episcopal Church. You have African American abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and David Walker and Harriet Tubman, all leading the cry for freedom in the North and the South, and even taking distinct steps like the Underground Railroad to take enslaved African Americans out of the South and into the North up to Canada. And that's going to create a push into the national politics, and we see the creation of a third party centered on abolitionism, the Liberty Party. And that's how you see this kind of movement into very much immediate emancipation, is the demand of abolitionists. People like William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator, is going to demand immediate emancipation quickly. All right. So I think that sets us up for period 5. You have massive change here. The big changes, of course, being the market revolution with the transportation revolution, the growth of the Second Great Awakening, and the development of the economy and the differentiation in the economy that's eventually going to create tension between the Northeast and the South. All right. Happy studying.